Today we are working with DuBois theory, and we are reading it through the lens of Cedric Robinson, who takes a look at all of DuBois theory and tries to explain how it connected with Marxism, in which ways it worked to change Marxism, to critique the Marxism that DuBois had access at the time. So his main contributions, DuBois's main contributions, were that slavery was not an accident and it was not something backward and connected with medieval ages, but that it was systemic and integral to capitalism, particularly in the United States, but also having an impact on capitalism throughout the world. So he made this connection between slavery in the United States, world capitalism, and imperialism. His other contribution, important contribution, was that he maintained that slaves and peasants were a revolutionary force and not the working class. He says that the working class that had gone through processes in Europe that were liberatory, especially those that we reviewed, like in Paris, the Commune of Paris, that was kind of lost on the way over, and the working class in the United States had the aspiration of becoming capitalists themselves. He also questioned the role of the vanguard that Lenin gave to the people that were highly educated in Marxism and were part of the political party, the Bolsheviks, that took over the Soviets in Russia and conducted the Soviet Revolution. He said that this role of the vanguard wasn't really all that key in raising consciousness and heading a revolution. So going to the point of the end of slavery and imperialism, he says that the end of slavery in the United States meant that there was more slavery in the global South, because capitalists could not exploit the workforce in the same way once the slaves were liberated. This increased what the Marxists called the contradictions in the global South. That is, there was more pressure to extract free or cheap labor in the global South now that there was this mass amount of labor that had been freed in the South. He explained that the farming and the extraction of raw materials were done in the South under slavery, and this is something that explains why the white rural worker lives in poverty in the United States. This is similar, if you remember, to Aníbal Quijano's claim that because the workforce was initially an enslaved workforce in the global South, particularly in Latin America, that created the conditions for low salaries for people of color in Latin America. So in a way, what Robinson and DuBois are saying here is similar in the sense that because you had people that were deemed as less than white people doing those jobs, now those jobs are still paid at lesser wages than the jobs that were deemed for white people. DuBois also thought that the ideal forces of racism and individualism had more consequence than the material conditions of production. And he based this idea in the fact that in the North there were many proletariats, but that consciousness never went beyond trade unionism. That means that although there were people working in factories, like Marx thought was really important, for capitalism to end, because it was his working force that was concentrated under a same roof, that could talk to each other, could talk with the vanguard, the people who were educated in Marxism, and make some changes. DuBois said, well, this is not quite the case, because in the North there were many proletariats, and still consciousness never went beyond the need to have a union in order to have decent wages. On the contrary, he juxtaposes to this what he calls a great strike post-emancipation, when over 9 million former slaves and white peasants walked out of the South. He connects also with John Brown's insurrection, and he says that the only reason why John Brown's insurrection did not succeed was because of racism and individualism, for ideological reasons, not for material reasons. So he says that there were 200 blacks in the Union Army, an even greater number of black workers that moved out of the South, and massive numbers of poor whites that also moved out of the South. So he calls this a great strike in the sense that people stopped working in the South, they moved out. And he considers that this was more of a revolution than anything else that happened in the United States until that point, at least. He says that plantations owner actively recruited poor whites for their cause by pitching poor whites against black. And this was especially important in the South because there were black legislators trying to change the laws of tenancy of the land. So white plantations owners were concerned that black people would start owning land, and they worked poor whites against blacks to make sure that this didn't happen. He also says that blacks established an alliance with northern white industrialists who quickly abandoned them when they no longer needed the votes. So some things to think about here. What DuBois calls a great strike, the fact that people did not organize a strike but walked out of that area and left those means of production without some part of the means of production, which were the people that were enslaved, that operated under these conditions, were not allowed to operate as human beings. They were more treated like property, which is what they were. So this abandoning of the South and the plantations for DuBois is a strike, and a strike that didn't require of the Bolsheviks to explain anything to black people, that black people got this idea that this wasn't working for them on their own, and they walked out. So perhaps the problem here is what we understand by revolution and what we understand by strike. If the workers in the South, people who were enslaved, walked out, this would be probably something akin to the proletariat of the Soviet Union taking over their factories, but it does not rise to the level of the proletariat of the Soviet Union taking over the state, because black people did not take over the state in any of these instances. So maybe here we have a problem of what do we mean by a revolution? In Marxist terms, revolution is a change in power of one class by another. The French had a revolution when they replaced the lords with the petit bourgeois. The Soviets had a revolution when they replaced nobles and business people, liberals, with the proletariat. But in the United States, in a Marxist sense, there's never been a revolution, because even the liberatory struggles that ended with the independence of the United States from England is not a revolution in that sense, since the class that spearheaded that liberatory struggle was exactly the same class that they were opposing in Britain. So there wasn't a change of class in the way that the United States was governed. There was a change of ethnicity, of nationality, an anti-imperialist struggle, but not necessarily a revolution. So DuBois and Robinson both argue that Marxism as we knew it died in Stalin's hands. And in this sense, many people agree with this statement. I've mentioned in class, and since 1968, when the students in Paris heckled the president of the Communist Party, there was a break of the harness that Soviet Stalinism had over leftist thinking. And it's obvious that this happens because under Stalin, there was really no development of Marxism as social studies. It became a dogma that had to be reproduced in order for people to survive. So he goes on to say that with the murder of Trotsky and other Bolsheviks, Soviet Marxism is no longer a living theory, and the struggles in Russia were reflected in the United States, with the left also feeling the impact of the leftist defeat in Spain. We didn't go through that in class, but there was a civil war in Spain where the anarchists and the Bolsheviks, Stalinists actually, fought against each other, which made them lose the civil war against fascism and ended with over 40 years of the reign of Franco, Catholic fascist. So these struggles within Marxism, Marxist forces in Europe also reach the United States. And the left in the United States focuses on supporting the New Deal, saving the Soviet Union, and that derives in trade unionism, the CIO, which was an organization more progressive than the AFL-CIO, a merge of those two forces. So he also indicts Marxists in the United States for being ambivalent towards Black liberation and progress, particularly the issue of slavery, as emancipation was, in a way, a bourgeois move of the North that needed labor that could be hired, and this labor was enslaved in the South. So in the North, in order for them to progress economically, they really needed to free the slaves in the South. So out of this reading, many Marxists thought that this was not a struggle that they could get on, until Lenin made them realize that they were making a huge mistake, and he sends instructions to communists in the United States to focus on the issue of Black labor. So the big deal, I think, with DuBois and his critique of Marx is that DuBois claims that Marx didn't see the revolutionary potential of the agrarian workers, of the workers at the plantations. So at the time of Marx, there were two main classes, and he defined classes by their relation to the means of production. So for him, as you know, there were the bourgeois and the proletariat, and he thinks that capitalism contains its own demise, because the proletariat that is part of capitalism will eventually uprise, or if they uprise, they would have the possibility of ending capitalism and ridding the world of the bourgeois. By ridding the world of the bourgeois, I don't mean that their plan was to assassinate every manager at every factory. I mean that they would take over the means of production, and if a bourgeois doesn't own the means of production, he is no longer a bourgeois. So in that sense, we are talking about the demise of the bourgeois. And he also thought, Marx, that there were lesser classes, the petit bourgeois, which would be most of us, middle classes, and the lumpen proletariat, who were the people that didn't have jobs, the very, very poor people. So the peasants in the Soviet Union were separated also within classes. The kulaks, that were the wealthy peasants, the middle peasants and the poor peasants, that we can also think of them as rural proletarians. And he thought that this class antagonism could be exploited by the proletariat, but this wasn't performed properly by the Bolsheviks first, and even in worse manner by the Stalinists. So DuBois thinks that the peasants, this idea that Marx has that the peasants are not capable of independent political action, is not quite true. That this was a situation that was mishandled by the Bolsheviks, but not necessarily the case for every revolution possible. He does think that peasants, especially the black peasants of the South of the United States, are capable of independent political action and do not depend either on the bourgeois or the proletariat, which was Marx's claim. So he says, DuBois, that slaves were isolated among white landowners who decoded the world for them, and that sometimes there were affective bonds between them, and the master was the only protection the slave had. So in some way, it's similar to the situation of the kulaks, the wealthy landowners, and the poor peasants that depended on the kulaks for everything. So he says that poor white peasants, professional mechanics, plantation overseers had natural alliances with landlords and were repelled by blacks. So he thinks that the ideology in the South had more power than the actual material conditions of production, because poor white people should have been closer to blacks, but they were not, because they believed that they were of a different ilk, basically, although their living conditions were not that different. So he says the configuration of material conditions and subjective conditions explain why there was no unity between white peasants and blacks. So on the one side, you have these material conditions that were how life was produced in the global in the U.S. South, and what kind of ideologies were derived from those material conditions. Those would be the subjective conditions, the way that people envision how they relate to their work, to their material conditions. He thinks that both of these situations explain why there couldn't be any unity between poor people in the South, white and black. So he talks about liberating the slaves by necessity. And he says something that many people affirm. Lincoln would have rather not freed the slaves, but he needed them in the army. He had to free them. Some folks also add here that there was a need for free labor, for proletariat labor in the North. The Confederacy wanted to keep the slaves, but the war they waged for that had the opposite effect, because they lost the war and the slaves were freed. So here he talks about a spontaneous revolution. What we mentioned earlier, this strike when people walk out of the South, both black and white, and in a way, by doing this, they change the landscape of the South, as these plantations immediately have to change or go bankrupt or start supposedly paying laborers. What actually happened was this sharecropping, where black people were still exploited. They were no longer slaves, but they were still exploited. But those were the minority of black people that remain in the South. A great majority of people just walked out of the plantations. So he calls this a spontaneous revolution. So he says that this revolution is not the result of a bourgeois societal development, but it came out straight of the backward plantation, with no development of bourgeois conscience, but development of black consciousness. So here I also have some problems with DuBois' understanding of what's going on here, because I don't think that Marx said that we needed development of bourgeois society in the sense of ideas or ideologies that would come out of that bourgeois society that the proletariat could use. I think Marx was talking about the conditions that were necessary to socialize the economy. From his viewpoint, if we socialize the economy in a country that is extremely poor, like the Soviet Union, that could result in brutal strife and issues because there's not enough wealth to socialize. So again, this idea that that Marx was wrong because there was no development of bourgeois consciousness when black people walk out of the South isn't quite a straight out critique of Marx, because Marx never said that in order for workers to take over their factory or to abandon the factory, they needed a political party. In any case, that would have been Lenin. But Marx did say that there was a need to increase wealth before socialization happened. But what happened in the South of the United States didn't require socializing wealth, because black people just walked out with the clothes on their backs. So I'm not sure where this critique actually lands. In any case, DuBois said that the slaves had produced their own culture and their own consciousness by adapting forms of the non-black society to the conceptualizations derived from their own historical roots and social conditions. So DuBois probably hadn't read Gramsci, so throughout this text I find that there's that the indictment to Marxist notion of ideology and revolution is simply based on what the Bolsheviks did in the Soviet Union, but Marxism had other ways of trying to understand this connection between consciousness and production that was complicated when Gramsci starts thinking about the issue of why was it different for the Italians to try to do a revolution than it was for the Russians. And he comes up with the theory of hegemony, how the working class sometimes takes on ideas that favor only the ruling classes, but these ideas are sold to the workers as ideas that favor all of us. This is something that I don't see in these critiques that Robinson and DuBois do of Marxism. So lots of stuff to think about here, as DuBois is clearly explaining to us a number of factors that explain why in the United States black liberation didn't necessarily go the way of proletarian liberation in Europe, for example. He talks about issues of ideology within the working class in the United States. He talks about differentials, different ways in which he assesses how the connection between production and ideology, and he comes out saying that it's not necessary to have a revolutionary party of people that were trained in Marxist ideas to conduct a revolution. Again, I think that what might be confusing things here is what we understand by revolution. I believe that DuBois doesn't have the same definition of revolution that Marx and Lenin work with. He's not talking about a change in the power that runs the state. He's talking about a huge change in the way that production was hegemonized by the white elites in the South and the connections that had with the northern capitalists. Bueno, material to think about. We'll talk about it in class.